You're listening to Your Words Unleashed podcast with host Dr. Leslie Wong, helping women scholars master their writing habits and publish a book that matters. Today, I'm thrilled to be chatting with David Mendes, PhD. He's the host and producer of Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD, a bilingual podcast that explores the many career paths available to PhDs beyond academia. With a background in cell biology and science communication, David helps researchers craft compelling career narratives and navigate career transitions with clarity and confidence. Since 2019, Papa PhD has featured over 300 guests and become a trusted resource for graduate researchers worldwide seeking purpose and direction after their degree. So I'm so excited to speak with another podcaster, especially someone who's been doing this for a lot longer than I have. And I also wanted to talk to David about science communication and how he helps PhDs craft empowering career stories that help them get jobs outside the academy. This is the 9th episode in my series on leaving academia. And if you haven't listened to them yet, you might want to start with number 1 and go in order. They address things like shifting your mindset, identifying and aligning with your values, and letting go of an academic identity in ways that move you towards a more satisfying future. So thanks so much for being here, David.
Thanks for having me, Leslie. It's really a pleasure. And like you said, to meet between podcasters and to meet someone else that is in the same ecosystem. It's really heartening to see how much help out there in the community for the academic people out there trying to be good academics, but also considering making a move out of academia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really thrilled to have you here. And so I always ask people about how they got to where they are. So can you first talk about your journey through academia and your transition into science communication and medical writing?
I've always been curious about how things work and about nature, and that brought me to finish it's a long degree, but now let's say my master's in Portugal in microbiology and genetics. But after that, I didn't go straight away to my PhD. I stayed and worked in the microbiology lab that I was at for my final project for a couple of years. Then taught a little bit in a taught lab, biochemistry, cell biology. And that's when I figured that I'd like to teach class. And what was needed was a PhD. And so after working a couple of years in between the two, teaching and also some communication in the medical domain already, that's when I launched into the PhD. And I got into a great PhD program in Portugal, the biology and biomedicine program at the University of Coimbra. And after a year of seminars, the moment came to choose where you want to do the research for your PhD. And that's when after visiting a few countries and labs, I landed in Montreal. And then I stayed. And that's where I am. I did all the lab part of my PhD in cell biology at the Montreal Neurological Institute, so the MNI, at McGill University. And then at the end of the PhD, and that's something I've since understood that a lot of people go through. So I started the PhD because I wanted to teach, and I finished the PhD, and I understood because of seeing my supervisor or other scientists around me, other lab directors, etc., what their day-to-day was. I understood that was not the career I wanted to follow. And I was a bit lost at first. And within a year, I have found out about medical writing, something I had never heard of as a career outlet for people with training in science, in my case, in life sciences. And so my scientific interest was always there, even when I was working before the PhD. It brought me to the PhD, and I switched from microbiology and genetics to cell biology and closer to neuroscience. And then going to the PhD showed me that was not my path. And that leads to why I started the podcast, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, no, I'm going to ask you for sure about your podcast. I feel like most of the people who listen to my podcast are humanities, social science folks. So can you explain what science communication is? Medical writing, like all of that, that whole world.
So my first, foray into science communication was actually before the PhD. So I was in Portugal, and this describes a basic need or a basic why of science communication. this project that I was on. At the time, the Portuguese government was for the first time going to offer generic drugs in pharmacies. And there was some resistance, there was some pushback from the medical community. There was a need. The need was for the government to give access to people, to the community, and to the population to generic drugs. But there was the perception from the drug administration in Portugal. Their perception was a reason for this pushback is a lack of understanding of what they are and also some preconceptions of what these drugs are and their quality, et cetera, et cetera. So they
Mm.
took young graduates, and I was one of 15 people ish, and they trained us to give a presentation to fill that gap of knowledge. So give a presentation. Also, we had materials that we were given to then support what we were sharing on the presentation and then to address objections that we were going to get. And then once we were trained in that aspect of things, they sent us throughout the country to the different medical centers to give the presentation, address objections, and then
Mm.
support this campaign. And science communication is basically that, but it can come in different colors and for different audiences. It can be within an organization, it can be to the wide public, it can be in a context of a pandemic where you need to explain things that need to happen and why, because you need people to adhere to certain behaviors, etc., or take some treatment that is new. We've been there, right?
Mhm.
So, science communication at large is this exercise of taking knowledge that is complex. Maybe there's a lot of jargon around it when we're in the lab doing it
Mhm.
or at university. In social sciences, we'll be talking with also a certain level of language that's probably has more jargon, and that when you're talking with experts, you expect they have the same background as you. So there's things you don't need to say or to explain because the assumption is there that we're on the same level in terms of knowledge. But then once you need to transfer that knowledge to a different audience, managers, deciders, parents, etc., you need to adapt. You need to find what the key aspects of the knowledge is that the different audiences need to take up, appropriate themselves, and then write it in a way that's adapted. And that's something that I learned and I was asked to learn, and we had to learn in that first medical writing job. So, medical writing, describing what I did in those first almost 5 years, it was taking medical, sometimes market data from the publication level. So, new indications for XYZ drug or new medical device coming out. And so, taking that level of writing, digesting it, and then preparing it and delivering it to an audience that in my case it was mostly sales pharma sales forces and or management. Sometimes it was like executive summaries, things like that. But the
Mhm.
idea was, again, and that's where I more formally was trained to take something complex, understand what are the layers that are important for us researchers, for us who are in the domain, but are going to just add friction to someone who's not in the domain, find that core that is like the minimum that needs to be passed on, and then package it in the right way for the
Right.
specific audience. That's basically it.
So that kind of translation, I think, is so, so important these days. And I know that there would be like a lot of postdocs and grad students that would have interest in moving into science communication. Like, where would someone start with that? Or what advice do you have for that?
There's a lot of interest today. Also, what I see, at least here in Canada, is that even the funding agencies now are adding in the grant requests, that the forms that they send out, they are adding sections that have to do with science communication. So,
Mm.
what has your
Mhm.
lab done? What has your group done in terms of science communication in your
Mm.
domain? Yeah, it's very important, and it's very important today also specifically because with the explosion of social media and of echo chambers and of
Mhm.
fake or fakeish news, et cetera, it's important that we who are in academia and who have created the data and know the data, have some role in also sharing it directly to different audiences. Things I've seen that really work well, and that here, I don't know around you, but here there's already in the research groups, in the research institutes, some recurring events and programs that are helping young researchers, the young scientists, dip their toe in the science communication pool. And I'm
Mm.
thinking about my thesis in the 3-minute thesis type things. So participating in SciComm contests or events that happen around you is a great way to, in a very low stakes context, just try finding something in your research that you want to share and popularize in a certain way. So decomplexify. And then if it's your thesis, get into one of these programs, you'll get coaching, and then you'll actually go on stage and deliver it. So that's one way.
Could be very scary for some,
It can be scary.
but yeah, sounds like a great experience.
Yeah. And now, after almost 7 years of podcasting, where I place myself in the extrovert introvert scale has changed, but I would have been very stressed during the PhD doing something like that. Today,
Right,
it'd
right.
be different. But other ways, and you see this if you open Instagram or even TikTok, if you have a medium, and in the past it's been blogging, it's still doable today, although it's less in fashion, let's say. But there's
Mhm.
platforms like, what's it called? There are platforms that are turning blogging into something more.
Oh, Substack?
Substack, that's it. Substack is a great one today. If you like writing, Medium was like that
Yeah.
for a while. I think Substack came and because they made it more encompassing, it's the one I think to target today. So you can write if that's your thing. You can have a platform, you can have your Wix website where you write about your subject of predilection. And of course, you need to think who you want your audience to be
Mhm.
and then adapt, like I was saying, your writing to that. But there's writing now. So TikTok, Instagram, some people have it really easy putting a camera and being in front of a camera and just doing something short and very instructive or funny also with humor. So there's the video aspect. Podcasting is also one. Every year I take part in here in Montreal, there's this ComSciCon, and it doesn't happen just here. At least in North America, there's more venues, more places where ComSciCon happens, where around 50 young scientists have a long weekend where they get like these master classes and
Mm.
they come with a project. That's how you get selected, is you suggest a SciComm project. And then you come out of that weekend with a more finalized project, but you will have met other like-minded people, some mentors and other people that are maybe in the media doing science
Mhm.
communication. So taking
Mhm.
part in this type of like wider programs is also good. I know in the States you have the Association for Science Communication, and one of the founders has been on the show, Kirsten Sanford, and they have resources, and there's a conference each year where you can, I think right now it's probably the proposal, the call for presentations, etc., is closed for this year, but each year they have a really great conference.
Mhm.
So that's it. It's trying to, either you're self-motivated and you launch your channel and whichever medium you prefer, or you hop on the bandwagon with something that's happening around you, be it a 3-minute thesis thing,
Mhm.
or be it a science communication conference or
Yeah.
training that's offered. Sometimes also departments or institutes now are actually offering training related with science communication. So that's it. So there's no formula. What's very special about it is, unless you're a scientific journalist, and it's very, how can I say, the format is very defined.
Mhm.
What's important if you want to launch yourself personally into science communication is that it's fun for you and that it looks and sounds like you, but also like the like things you like. So
Right.
one thing that can inform you is, what do you like seeing? What is it that you like in the media that you watch or that you consume? And then do your version of it. It's a best way to start, to have less friction, I say.
Yeah, no, I think those are really fabulous, super useful suggestions there. Like, depending on people's level of like proactivity, they can
Yeah,
choose their path. But it does
exactly.
mean making some decisions, connecting with others, taking part in certain things. So I think that is all really great. And now I want to ask you about your podcast.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what originally inspired you to start Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD? I mean, first of all, that's a really interesting name for a
Yeah.
podcast. And, you've done 300 of these. So, like, what has the podcast taught you? Why did you do it? Why do you still do it? All the things.
Yeah, I touched upon it a few minutes ago, and the why or the origin of it was my transition to that first position after the PhD
Hmm.
because, and in my case, the end of the PhD was a climb in difficulty and in troubleshooting. And I had less and less, let's say, bandwidth to look at different things, to network, etc. Plus the thesis writing, which meant that I didn't prepare. I didn't network per se during the PhD. I was a visiting research student from abroad. It meant that between trying to go back to Portugal in my case, and some at least once a year, but also dealing with the fact that I was having these technical difficulties, etc., meant that a lot of the things that I now really recommend during the different interviews that I have on my podcast, I didn't do them then. And it took some time after getting my degree to look back and to see those gaps and those holes in the way I navigated all of that. But so the origin is the difficulty I had right after the PhD. Another part of it was that because I didn't go into medical writing right away, I was doing some tutoring for a school board here in Quebec, but it was a part time job and it was for adults that wanted to shift their university path and they needed to do some pre university subjects that they hadn't and that were blocking them from going into, let's say, health related university training. So I did that for a while. But like I said, it never became full time and I kept looking. But once I was in that medical writing path, I got invited to a first career day and then a second career panel, things like that. And the issues that I really took it upon myself, that difficulty at the end, I thought, okay, this was all me. And now I need to figure something out. So I floundered for a little bit. And thankfully, like organic networking led me to that first touring job. And then the next one, actually, it was more my effort of going back and asking or trying to find out where people in my institute were working. That's what led me to medical writing. But what I understood after 1, 2, 3 career panels was that those difficulties that I thought were just me, there was a bunch of young graduates or almost graduates that had those same questions, those same
Hmm.
doubts, and felt those same gaps. So that's what led me to understand, okay, there's something here missing in the preparation of graduate students. They are well versed in their domains of research, not well versed in career readiness. And
Right.
it's not them, it's a systemic thing. There's no mandatory course on career preparation. They exist, but often they're optional and depending on the domain. Like in my case, I can't imagine going back in time, a PI around us being very pleased that their student took part of their afternoon to go take a class on career readiness. It would actually be frowned upon, right?
Right.
So that's the why. And then why I actually started the podcast was like a concurrence of circumstances that I was playing the clarinet in this band. I was the guy who had the tech, so the microphone, etc. So I had gear that I could use for a podcast. And in
Uh-huh.
2019, I saw it was on Facebook, I think, why you should start your podcast in 2019. And I
Hmm.
had been to a career fair, a career event not long ago, so it was fresh in my mind. And those things together, stars aligned, and I said I could start a podcast. And I know people who were doing their PhD in the next bench beside me or next lab, and who are now entrepreneurs, who are now in science communication, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see if they want to tell their story. And I asked 5 and they said yes. And then another 5 and they said yes. And that was the beginning of it.
What's kept you going? 300 is a lot. I just hit
Yeah.
100 episodes and I'm like, oof, that was a lot.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe one thing I can touch upon, and it has to do with how you launch yourself into science communication. And I think it's important to mention, and this is the point where it happened for me, is knowing the audience you want to talk to. And not just knowing it very vaguely, but having almost a file on them, what age range they are,
Hmm.
male, female, whichever gender. But try to have a persona is the term that's used when we're thinking of a communication project.
Hmm.
It's important to not only to have a message you want to take and share with the world, but the world is very wide. You need to really have, and I had 2 personas. One was a male there was a name, there was an age, there was a where they were professionally, almost character description. If you're playing like Dungeons and Dragons, right? You have a lot of details on that person,
Hmm.
and that then informs how you write to them, what guests you bring on the show, if it's a guest show, what subjects you choose, what guests you refuse. For me, it's something that happens quite often is people reach out and say that doesn't align with my persona, so I'm sorry, but it's not going to work. Yeah, I hadn't mentioned that, and it's really important. And for me, it was easy because I was seeing them every time I was going to one of these events. It was easy to say, okay, this is last 1-2 years of the PhD, first 1-2-3 years after. That's my
Hmm.
persona. Why I continue is because one, I learned something with every conversation, and you probably have this experience
Right.
because you exchange some emails with a guest, and most of my episodes are with guests. I haven't had the inspiration and I haven't found it in me to do solo episodes yet. Maybe
Hmm.
it'll come at some point. But it's this possibility and this, for me, especially who I was, and I consider myself an introvert. Like I said, I think and I feel that doing this for all this time has changed how I perceive even myself and how I'm perceived. But at the beginning, it wasn't easy to, for example, to invite someone who hosts a podcast that I had been listening to for years. But I mustered up the courage and I did it, and it was fun. Yeah, it's this connection, this possibility of every week, almost every week, meeting someone new, talking about this specific question of what did you do after your PhD? So there's that, there's this personal, selfish side of it. But then with time, there was something else, which is finding out that people who are in their professional journey, and some of my guests have been academics also, not just people outside of academia, but they're in their journey and they have never been asked about their journey. And
Mm.
so, one thing I've found is I really enjoy it when I finish an interview and I get this very positive energy or positive, even words. Sometimes people say, David, you know what? That story that I told, I hadn't told it for 10 years or since my PhD, I hadn't even thought of it. And so I started also appreciating a kind of a service that I was offering unknowingly to the guests of being able to, for that hour, have a stage to share things that they had maybe not talked about in years. Good ones, less good ones. The important thing is that I felt that it was kind of a two-way street. I was getting something from getting to know this person, but they were also appreciating the fact of having this platform to talk about their successes, but also their difficulties. And I think also people, at least in this community, they like the feeling that they're helping the next generation somehow not fall into the pitfalls that they had. And yeah, those two things have kept me going. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's very inspiring. And it's interesting because I'm definitely an introvert, but interviews I've always been fascinated by. I'm trained as a qualitative researcher, so interviewing was a big part of what I did. And so it's also like a transfer of a skill, right? From
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
academia to non-academia. And I think it's always interesting that there are tangible benefits for people from being interviewed, from telling their own stories. And I think probably even more when you are telling it publicly, right? Because it's kind of like, let's not reinvent the wheel. I mean, that's part of why I do any of what I do is like, I made these mistakes. I really don't want people to have to go through what I did if they could avoid it. So that really resonates with me. And so you've talked to like so many people. How has your own perspective on what's possible for
Mhm.
PhDs beyond academia shifted
Mhm.
and changed?
First thing that I understood after all these conversations, or the most important one, is that it's going to sound a bit vague, but our vision is what limits our possibilities. And when we come out of the process of getting a PhD, we have this kind of tunnel vision, which is success is tenure track career. That's it.
Right.
And so our vision is blurred from that to the left and to the right of that. It's blurred. And we feel that sometimes even people feel that anything but that is a demotion or a failure, even. And that's also another motivation to keep on going and just to add, because you made me think of it, is this is having impact, a negative impact on the mental health of young researchers.
Mhm.
And like I said, more and more institutions are offering either training or support, or be it in science communication or career readiness, etc. But it's not generalized, and there's a lot of anxiety out there. As long as I see that it's out there, I have a reason to be doing these interviews, basically. But a lot of this anxiety is because of, lack of information. It's not because there's nothing out there, but we just don't know about it because we've been in this sprint, tunnel vision for 3, 4, 5 years, etc. And we haven't just raised our gaze a little bit and looked to the horizon. And
Mhm.
not just look. And that's also one of the key things that I say is talk with people. It's to widen your network while you are a young scientist, while you are even in graduate school. And there's different ways to do that. But what I want to say with this is basically, after a PhD, you can do anything. And now I'm going to give some examples. This means that you can take your career and say, I'm going to take this idea from the lab and make it a business, and you become a scientific entrepreneur. That's really a project that's led by you. You can also, especially in my domain, for example, say, I want to keep doing what I'm doing in the lab, at the bench, in the private sector. And you can be an R&D scientist in a pharma or something like that. Then, for example, in your case, social science humanities, it's different. The type of skills that you've developed can allow you to do many things. You can, again, have your own career as a consultant, depending on what domain you work on. A lot of people end up finding their career goals and their career journey in taking their knowledge from university into different organizations through consulting. I've seen a lot of guests doing that. And then, because of the ease of dealing with complexity, the ease of dealing with long projects, working within an organization, within government, in large projects, I met someone, she had a PhD in rehabilitation, but she is working in a pan-Canadian kindergarten, like government subsidized kindergarten for everyone project.
Mhm.
It's not related to her domain of research that she worked on, but all the transferable skills she brings from research, she can use and she's putting to use in these types of large projects. Now, when I say this, it may be a little bit disheartening for people listening because, saying I can do everything, it's the same as there's nothing specific that I can do.
Right.
So there's a magic ingredient, and I kind of alluded to it a few seconds ago, and a magic ingredient to all of this, which is people. It's networking. I don't know if you want me to pause and react to what I just said, but I think that's the next ingredient and the next thing I'd like to talk about.
I think you definitely should because there are so many academics who say, I'm terrible at networking. I hate networking.
Hmm, hmm.
Networking is the worst, or I don't know how to do it, so I'm just not going to do it. So, any tips or strategies for networking, especially for
Hmm.
introverts, would be helpful.
Yeah, a lot of people in conferences I've given that have come after the conference, they didn't ask a question during, but then they come at the end. That's typical of us
Right.
introverts,
Yeah.
and they feel the same. First, the thing about networking is you hear the word and it elicits some images. Oh, I need to put on a suit. I need to, I don't know, to print business cards. I need to go to these events and schmooze and
Mm.
try to act a certain way. That image, I don't like it. It's nothing. And I remember going to an event a long time ago with that frame of mind, and it just felt weird and leaving an intro. Yeah, you don't feel like you're at your best. But to that, one first thing is, because at least for us introverts, the thing that stresses us is now I need to act a certain way. I need to look like an extrovert, which
Mm.
is the
Mhm.
toughest thing because you're the opposite, right? And the first thing I want to deconstruct is you don't need to act a certain way, and you can be who you are. And actually, you should be who you are, because if you act a certain way and it's, let's say it works, someone wants your contact and wants to reach out, let's say it's a job opportunity, but then you're someone different during the job interview process, there's a disconnect and you can't
Yeah.
fake it throughout that relationship.
Right.
So authenticity is important. And one for introverts specifically, one superpower that we have, and I think that's why we're doing interview podcasts and we have these microphones and headphones, etc., is listening.
Hmm.
And I would say that if I could talk to me like 15 years ago, I would say don't go with a script of something to say, go with a list of questions to ask.
Ah,
So why are you here? Let's say it's specifically scientists that are there. Okay, what domain do you work on? Why are you interested in networking? Another thing, if you go to events, sometimes you have access to the list of people who are going. So to help yourself, try to identify people who you'd be interested to talk with. And this also applies to conferences, scientific conferences, and prepare questions in advance for
yeah.
that specific person. And once you ask people, and it's a bit like me starting that podcast and seeing that people were actually eager to share, it's the same in a networking setting. Once you become the interviewer, it's much more comfortable and people will be happy to share something. And eventually they'll ask you a question. And then you just need to follow their cue. There's no, okay, now I need to appear and I need to say, hi, I'm so and so, and blah, blah, I have a script. You don't need
Right.
that. And that's not ideal at all. Because what'll happen is that eventually it's kind of a tennis game. You'll ask one, two questions, and then there's going to be a question coming back, and just
Hmm.
then you'll just answer. And that's for me has been a learning that actually doing the podcast has been a gym for me for that muscle of being in that listening mode more than performing or acting.
I
Yeah.
think that's great. I mean, starting with listening. And I think also recognizing that definitely, I think a lot of people will be super happy to talk about themselves. But if they're not, like if they don't want to engage, it's not personal.
It's
You
never.
don't have
It's
to
true.
take that as a reason to stop networking.
No, for
Maybe they
sure.
had a bad day. Maybe they're in a rush. I just know that a lot of people get dejected easily.
Yeah, no, that's true because yeah, often if you're introverted, you're also very self-aware, and so you can take it personally quite easily. This also applies to a lot of networking can be done on LinkedIn today or similar
Yeah.
platforms. That also applies. Sometimes you write and they're super busy. They don't answer. It's never personal.
Right.
It's just not the moment. Yeah, never take it personally because then, it puts you out of balance and the evening is lost. But yeah,
Right. Right.
so going into a cluster of people, just listening in and then trying to go with the flow, but asking questions. For me personally, it would be easier one on one. So I'd try to see another person who's maybe looking for someone to talk to than going into a group. But going into a group that's dynamically talking can work also because same thing as in LinkedIn. If you get into a LinkedIn group, you can see what people are talking about, understand the main interests, and then eventually post something or reply to a comment that's already ongoing. So it takes off that pressure of now
Right.
I have to put out something new out there and awesome.
Right. Be part of the conversation. This leads into some of the work that you do, I think, around
Mhm.
helping people craft stories about their careers. So
Yes,
I'm really curious about this because I'm not totally sure what a career story is. So can you clarify what that is and how people
sure.
can craft one?
Yeah, the reason why I gravitated towards this idea of strategic storytelling and career storytelling is that a lot of the young people that I talk to and that have gone, let's say, to a career fair and tried to engage in a career conversation with a potential employer, they have this difficulty of talking about what they bring to the table professionally in a way that resonates with the person in front of them who is not an academic
Right.
because again the academia formatting it trains us to not only think of what we do in a certain way but talk about what we do in a certain way with a lot of jargon, with a lot of underlying knowledge that we don't talk about because we're all experts in the domain. It's, how can I say, it's expected that we all know. It's a ground on which we base all
Right.
of our conversation, and those first conversations, and usually people learn and then they get coaching and whatever, and they change the way they talk. But the scientific and academic way of talking is very data, it's very cold. And it's not so much a story as kind of a pearl necklace of accomplishments, publications,
Mm,
etc. That does not bring any emotion. It's not warm. There's no thread that someone who's not from the domain can easily understand. Okay, this is what the person means.
Or why it matters to them.
Yeah, why it matters to them, exactly, to them or to their final user, etc. But the other thing is, because we spend all these years working on this very pointy subject, we tend to just talk about that, about who I am academically in within my highest degree, which is, let's say, the PhD. But for someone who's hiring you and who is thinking, okay, is this person going to fit into my team? Does this person understand the mission of my company or my organization in a wider sense and its importance to our end users or clients or to the general, let's say it's in the government, to the general public? If you just focus on those 5 years, you're missing on a lot of your story as a person
Mhm.
that will help them better have a feel of, okay, this would be a great addition to my team. And so, what I mean with this strategic storytelling is to take a step back from the detail and the granularity of your research and try first to, and then develop some discourse on why it is important in a more general sense. Why does this, for example, you could think, why I was in an institute, in a part of an institute that was called the Neuronal Survival Center. So even that, the name of your research group may be a starting point for how to talk about what I do without the granularity, but with a mission that someone who's not an expert will understand. The first part is step back from the details of the research and tell what you do in a way that, let's say, someone you meet in the elevator or your grandma would understand. That's one thing. And
Right.
that's part of what often we say that science communication is, can you explain it to your 12-year-old nephew? Then you've done something interesting. The other thing is, you were someone before your graduate degree. And so the storytelling that I want people to do, the way I think it's interesting is to also, so take that step back and widen your gaze to go back. So why actually did you go into science? Why
Right.
actually did you get interested in neuronal degeneration? Is it because you had a loved one who was affected by a disease? Are you in this or that domain because you have this or that preoccupation or goal in terms of improving society or communities around you? And once you start telling this narrative that has people, that has community, that has conversations in it, that doesn't have just data. And of course, I'm talking coming from life sciences. It's an article in a journal in my domain. It's very dense and very, how can I say, it's not palatable, let's say, for everyone to go through through that. But I'm sure in the human sciences also, there's some publications, some writing that can be very dense also and very almost
Yeah.
hermetic. So just a simple thing, and I'm simplifying it a lot, is to, in this process of changing from I have bullets to share on I did this, I published this,
Mhm.
is okay, step back. So you're far enough from the CV that now they're blurred, you can't see them. How can you tell a story that starts before, goes through that part of your life, and then brings us to today, but considering in all of that the eyes of the person or the ears of the person in front of you, and how they can make sense of that without being thrown off by all the jargon, etc. People need a story. People need to retain something and to remember someone, a story with difficulties, obstacles, how the obstacles were cleared, goals, visions. It's always better, it's more memorable, and it'll do a better job at creating this image in the mind of the person considering hiring you of who you are as a human with skills, with an expertise, but that will need to then interact with a team that's already there or
Right.
people on the ground, etc. I don't know
Yeah.
if this is too vague or if this
N-
makes
no,
sense to you.
it makes perfect sense to me, actually. And I think that just in hearing you talk today, there's like some common themes, right? So one of them is like your why. You know
Hmm.
your why, and that why is that thing that connects ideally the different milestones in your life and career. and brings you to also like beyond the academy. So values, right? Mission, purpose, but I think also knowing your audience, like
Yes,
centering the needs of your audience and recognizing that like you are no longer talking to your dissertation committee. Like
exactly.
an employer doesn't need to know. I think granularity is the right word, like the really fine details. They want to know that you probably they already know if you have a PhD, like you're really intelligent, you can do the work, but they want to know who you are as a person, what makes you
Mhm.
tick, and that you can join their team and that you're like, it's gonna work out on a three-dimensional human level.
Yeah, and that's why if you say, actually, when I was a teenager, I was, the scouts, or I've always done this sport or this martial art, anything that adds to this very 2D thing that is a CV and makes you a 3D person who
Right.
has interests, values, etc., is something that we in academia, you don't talk about that because it doesn't make sense. It's not important. It's fluff. But in this context, it's actually what's important. It says, okay, we
Mm,
know you're very good in your domain. We know academically you have the skills, but how are you as a human? How do you interact in a team setting? How do you deal with adversity, etc.? And that is best told with stories. And so
mhm,
it's important to find examples and to identify in your journey, either like I was saying, things that you were part of and that you're proud of that are not specifically academic. And it could be different things. For some people, it's during graduate school, I was also in the theater group and I organized XYZ. But also the other things like that martial art that you've been doing since you're young, that interest that you have that is really off topic from your research, but that makes you who you are. Those
mhm.
things are important, and it's important not to, like we do very often in academia, relegate them to, oh, this is just fluff. What's important is my list of publications, etc.
Yeah, widening the focus there and humanizing things. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's so helpful. So one last question for you. So right now the job market is horrible. It's always been pretty bad in academia, but it's a lot worse now, at least in the United States. And for a grad student or a postdoc who's listening who feels really stuck or scared or unsure of what's to come, like what do you want them to know? What piece of advice can they take with them?
The world needs you, needs your brains, needs all those transferable skills that we were mentioning, your perseverance, your resilience, your ability to work on long-winded projects. For us, because you're surrounded by people who do that every day, it's a given. But I don't know in the States what the statistic is, but I think in Canada, there's 2% of people in the population who have PhDs. It's really not a lot. So there's a lot of like blind spots for us because we're in these institutes, these departments surrounded with these people who are all doing the same type of thing that are brilliant, etc., that we probably admire, that we end up not mentioning or not considering things as special in the skills that we have. And they are special outside academia. They are prized. They are important. So the world needs you. There's issues, the climate, migration, policy. There's so much out there of complex issues that needs people like you. Now, how do you access those ecosystems that are not at a stone's throw from where you are? Again, I was saying it's the magic ingredient. It's networking. Is you need to get to know people outside your small, let's say, circle of your domain of research
Right.
and get to be known. And because again, it's a two-way street.
Right.
And once you say, okay, until the end of my PhD, once every 2 weeks, first I'll identify someone that I want to reach out to. And this needs to be authentic because I have an interest for what they do or for the type of communication they share on LinkedIn in my domain. And I will reach out. I will say, look, I am in this year of my PhD. I am interested in what you do, or I saw this publication that you did last week, and I wanted to reach out and learn a little bit more about what you do in where you are in government or where you are in the private
Mhm.
sector, because I'm trying to also figure out where I'm going to be in 2, 3 years.
Right.
And that's not too complicated. People might not answer like we said, but you know what? Most people do, and they're super happy to again help someone who's coming up that ladder to share the journey, how they navigated it, and give some advice. You might even get some mentorship if things click and if the connection is there.
Right.
But basically, for me, based on all the conversations I've had, the terrain is full of organizations, teams that need people like you. But today, especially, visibility is super important. And because the market is difficult, companies and institutions and organizations want to make sure they hire the right person as fast as possible. And the shortcut for them to do that is to hire people who can be vouched for by someone already in the
Right.
organization. Creating this network of authentic connection with people who are in the ecosystem, who are out there on the terrain, will be the key for a quicker transition after getting your degree. Because if a dozen of people in the public sector, in the private sector, etc., that you've engaged with in the last 6 months, you can, by the end of your PhD, say, "Hey, Frank," or "Hey, Ellen, just letting you know that in 2 months I'm defending and we've been talking for a while. You know my interests. If you see something out there, if you know of a team or someone who needs someone like me, just send me a DM and I'll be glad to discuss." And that's it. But you can only do that if you've planted those seeds months in
Right.
advance.
Exactly.
Doing the search and the networking when you're on the market for a job is really tough because then you're entering conversations with this transactional frame of mind
Mhm.
and that mars the conversation itself.
Yeah.
The other way to do this, and some people really have great results this way, is to implicate yourself, to get involved with professional associations in your domain
Right.
and then volunteering. So in my case, it would have been Society for Neuroscience or something like that. And that's another way to not only network and get to know people who are from maybe far away geographically, other universities, but also you're working with them in projects. And so they're really getting to know you and they can really vouch for you to connect you to someone else.
Absolutely. In sum, put yourself out there, talk
Yes,
to people, take some risks, right? And
exactly.
have some real authentic conversations. Allow
Yep.
people to know you and how amazing you are. David, this has been such an incredibly useful conversation. What are the best ways for listeners to connect with you?
If they go to papaphd.com, there's ways to contact me there. And then same thing, if you listen to Beyond the Thesis on whichever app you prefer, there's always possibility to comment on an episode that you've liked. But the best way is on LinkedIn. So if you look for
Mhm.
David Mendes, PhD, or David Mendes Papa PhD, you'll find me. And then that's the best way to reach out. I may not respond immediately, but I respond to every message I receive.
Good on you. Okay, so folks, please listen to David's wonderful podcast and reach out to him, especially if you're looking for ways to write your own career story. So
Mhm.
I will talk to you all again soon. Thanks for tuning in to Your Words Unleashed podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with other writers or leave a rating and review. To find the full transcript and catch all the latest from me, check out my website, yourwordsunleashed.com. I'll talk to you next time. Happy writing!